Welcome to The State of Us.
Beyond mainstream cable news and party lines, with a millennial and a boomer, The State of Us pushes past the noise and uncovers all the issues that matter.
Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
There is little doubt the 2020 election captured the attention of the nation, both leading up to it and the aftermath. With incredible turnout for a modern election, what's next for America? Well, to find out, we have to look at a time period in American history that many of us might overlook, but it holds many of the answers to what might be next for our raucous and divided country. Lance Jackson, my co-host and an educator of 35 years, is the senior resident historian at TrueChat, and will introduce our guest.
Our guest is author Jon Grinspan, who has my dream job. He is the Curator of Political History at the Smithsonian National Museum of American History. He frequently contributes to the New York Times and is regularly featured elsewhere. Today, we get to discuss his new book, The Age of Acrimony: How Americans Fought to Save Their Democracy from 1865 to 1915. Jon, thanks for taking time to chat with us.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thank you for having me on. I'm so excited to talk about this history with you guys.
Jon, we're looking forward to diving in, but before we do, Lance, what's our word of the day?
Well, I think it is apropos to choose the word acrimony. Some of them may not know, okay, so it's the age of acrimony. What in the heck is acrimony? Well, according to Webster's Collegiate Dictionary, acrimony is the bitterness or harshness of temper, manner, or speech.
Jon, your book covers an immense amount of material, and certainly not something that we have time to talk about all of today, but it focuses on a time period that most of us probably don't actively think about, 1865 to 1915. So when you were writing this book and after you finished it, who are you hoping reads it, and what do you think people might learn or take away from it?
Well, first off, I just got cold sweats because I thought I was going to get quizzed on the dictionary definition of acrimony. So I'm glad that I didn't get put on the spot. But, you know, as Lance said, it means bitterness. It goes with kind of an acrid taste. And I guess this kind of gets to your question of who this book was intended for and what people will learn. As a curator of the Smithsonian, I travel all around the country collecting objects from present day politics, from conventions, protests, elections. And I've talked with people all across the political spectrum who express some kind of shared sense that something was acrid in their democracy. Something was leaving them with a bad taste in their mouth. Something seems broken and particularly hostile right now. And I really wanted to let these people know that while I can't fix what's going on today, there really is a precedent. We call our politics unprecedented, but there really is a period in our history where politics was acrid and angry and highly engaged and kind of ever present. And we've had to fight to save our democracy in the past from, you know, partisanship and anger and political violence. And I'd really like to let people know who feel the sense of acrimony, who feel the sense of kind of fear and anxiety, that there is also reform that's possible, that this history kind of draws out the kind of the darkest moments in our politics, but also the fact that many of those things were addressed and that it's not the end of the world, that we can kind of address some of the problems we're dealing with today, just as they managed to in the past.
Lance, it almost sounds like he's been listening to The State of Us and knows that you just tell everybody that nothing is unprecedented. You know, basically we can find examples of everything, right?
I was just thinking, we all know that we think, oh, okay, this has happened in my lifetime, and so it's never happened like this before. And it's like, it's why we study history, people. It's why you should have paid attention in high school. But no, as Justin suggested, Jon, from 1865 to 1915, or the age of acrimony, as you describe it, is a period many people just gloss over. You know, in history class, oh, this is just, you know, a bunch of changes. You had a bunch of presidents from Ohio. None of them were any good. And, you know, the mediocre seven and all that kind of stuff. But there are a lot of important parallels to today's society that can be found in this time period. So specifically, what are two or three, in your mind, the most notable things that occurred during this time that might surprise people or that people didn't learn about in history class?
I think, first of all, just setting aside the presidents, no offense to the great presidents of Ohio, just...
I called them the mediocre seven, so it's okay. And
some of those guys are good. You know, James Garfield could have done a great job, but more importantly, there's so much more going on than the presidents in any one time in American history. You know, there's between 30 and 90 million people in this period in history. So there's a lot going on. Don't just worry about the presidents. I think people will kind of look at them and turn off. But this is this is a period when there's really kind of an interesting crisis of democracy and this huge arc and narrative of a rising, a cresting, and kind of a falling in faith in democracy and popular politics. And you can see in the early years after the Civil War, with the expansion of the right to vote to working people, to African Americans, this huge boom in participation and this idea that kind of mass turnout and mass big elections are going to solve America's problems. And you see that kind of arcing into the 1870s and the 1876 election, which is kind of famously ugly. And this curdling in the sense that democracy won't solve people's problems. And maybe America should get rid of democracy, or democracy is dying, or that Americans are killing it themselves with their own behavior. And that arc kind of turning to what I call a great quieting around the turn of the century, when people stop voting, people kind of calm down, and you can see the good and the bad of a less engaged political system. So I guess I'd really like people to take away just a sense of kind of flexibility and variability of our history of democracy. We kind of imagine we have these 45 presidents and these great people in the past, but there's just so much change and flux and ugliness, but also resilience in this history.
There's ebb and flow, right? There's change. And that's the beauty of our government and the Constitution and our laws, and that there are at the times when it looks like it's going to be the worst, we bounce back. I mean, all of those institutions seem to adapt to what's necessary.
Yeah. I mean, James Madison called the Constitution a machine that will go of itself. It's not like these guys set something going in the 18th century and it's just, kind of chugged along. It's had a life of its own and changes of its own. And sometimes those changes are really awful. Sometimes people lose the right to vote. Sometimes people lose their lives. But some of those changes can also calm things down and make people more civil and more civic minded. So there's just a ton of flexibility. I think we have a really simple narrative of our past, and there's just so much in there once you dive into it.
Lance pointed out that, for so many of us, and I mean, I don't know that anybody is immune to this. We view everything through the lens of what we've experienced in life most of the time. And so it makes it hard to imagine this time that you describe, where our politics were probably more raucous and definitely more violent than we've seen even in the last few years. But indeed, the whole point of your book is that there was, in fact, a time. We saw some of the highest sustained voter turnout in American history, yet we also seemed to be more divided than ever before. So then progressives kind of moved to calm things, and subsequently the calming actually dropped turnout. So we've got this weird sort of paradox we've all talked about. We need higher voter participation. We need more people voting. And it looks like, we have the 2020 election, the 2016 election, more people voted, but that didn't seem to bring us any closer together. Arguably, it actually pushed us further apart. So what should we make of this phenomenon of high voter turnout and division, lower voter turnout, and at least the appearance of more unity?
I think you're pointing at the central question of the book and of this history. I mean, you have this first phase, say 1865 to the 1890s or so, when, as you say, turnout is astounding. It's average on the national level is 77%, and states like Ohio, Indiana, New York State averaged 90% turnout in like 5 straight presidential elections over 20 years. So there's just incredible engagement from people who can vote and people who are denied the right to vote are still reading the newspapers, arguing the issues. They really have participation down, right? Like they've really built this system that's great at getting those who can vote to go out and participate and to argue the issues and to pay attention. What they really are struggling with is civility, because there's also the peak of political violence. You might get beat up or shot at the polls. There's the Reconstruction. There's all these political parties that are warring with each other. So it kind of asks, how does we want high participation. We want a civil and safe and clean political system. But if you look at our history, we really have this trade-off where it's hard to get both at once. And I'm not a political scientist. I can't tell you that there's an iron law that one goes up when the other goes down. And I don't really believe in iron laws of history because there's just so much change in human behavior. But we do have this legacy in our country of this really old democracy where we can get participation without civility, or we can get civility without participation as high. But, we're seeing in our own era, as you say, as turnout goes up, people start to behave in ugly ways, or vice versa. As people behave in ugly ways, turnout seems to go up. So I don't have any answer for the future or what's kind of inherent in human nature, but we have seen the trend line we're on, the kind of the U curve of voter turnout before. And we've seen some of these things happen before.
To me, it kind of makes sense. I mean, if I'm involved and I'm parading or I'm speaking or I'm listening and we talk about this all the time, my side loses, then I feel rejected, so I get violent. It becomes personal, right? If I go along like, oh, who's running for president? I don't know. Who's in charge of the Senate? I don't care. I'm going to work every day and raising my kids. Then I don't get as upset. And I think so. It kind of makes sense when you think about it that the more involved people get, the more, as Justin said, the more personal it becomes.
I think though too, right? Part of the division, and John, you talk about this a little bit in the book, is the nature of not only are people more involved, but we've only given them, or we were only really giving them two real choices. So not only are people more involved, but you're also fitting them into, and that's kind of the interesting nature of, you're highlighting how Will Kelly's career obviously changes over time. Him feeling like, well, I don't really fit in anywhere. And so then there's some angst of, well, I need to do something, and I because I've invested all this time and energy, but who do I give my time and energy to? Because there's only one right answer, and it's Democrat or Republican, right?
Yeah, that's so right on. And both answers are bad. Honestly, I know I'm saying this 150 years in the future, and my politics are different than these people's, but neither of these parties back then are going to solve the problems they're being presented with. The kind of the disruption, the income inequality, all the problems in society, they're not equally bad. Like the 19th century Democratic Party is pretty ugly, but so is the Republican Party. Neither of these big, huge options, these kind of two tribes that are warring in the center of American life, can solve the issues being presented to America. And so it kind of drives up their agitation even more, because they turn out in these huge numbers, they march, they vote, they drink, they throw bricks at the other side, and then they get Grover Cleveland in office or Rutherford B. Hayes. They get these guys who are who can't tackle the Gilded Age problems and all the issues that are coming to the fore. So I think the struggle between two parties and the struggle with parties that aren't really offering substantive change amps up this aggression even more, kind of, because it becomes so much more about the tribe.
We've been talking with Jon Grinspan about the importance of understanding the 1865 to 1915 time period. But a number of questions still remain. How do these lessons from the past foreshadow what the future might hold for our divided nation? Jon says that we might not be able to use them as predictors, but we're going to try to nail him down on a few answers. To find out what he has to say, keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back.
We are The State of Us. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
Today we're speaking with Jon Grinspan about his new book, The Age of Acrimony, How Americans Fought to Save Their Democracy from 1865 to 1915.
Well, John, you said, don't focus on the presidents, and I think you're right. But as this era that you picked to write about closed, we were in the midst of some interesting developments, and that is we had 4 constitutional amendments passed in about 7 years. And just for those folks that are like, what? We had the establishment of the income tax, the direct election of U.S. senators, the right for women to vote, and the start of prohibition. So,
Lance, wait, you mean that we didn't always directly elect senators?
No, we didn't always.
We didn't vote on. Oh, okay.
Yeah, and we didn't always have an income tax. I mean,
oh my gosh.
The first income tax was during the Civil War by Abraham Lincoln to help pay for the war, and then we did away with it. But it's amazing that you think about trying to get agreement on a constitutional amendment today. So what had to happen for that to take place? And do you think that we're in a situation where we could see something like that, see a flurry of activity dealing with the Constitution to try to deal with some of the issues that are dividing us?
Well, I do agree. It feels like we're overdue. I mean, if you look at American history, there are these bursts of amendments in the 1860s, around the turn of the century, in the 1960s. And we haven't had much reform in quite some time. And there are a lot of issues that could face constitutional amendments. I think what's really interesting about that big jump in change is if you were alive in 1880 or 1890, you would never believe that in 20 years or in 10 years, you're going to have this huge kind of revolution in how Americans govern. You wouldn't accept it because things seem so gridlocked and so partisan and so ironbound that it would be almost incomprehensible to believe that such rapid change was right around the corner. And then it comes and it really seems to revolutionize American life. I mean, this generation of progressive reformers really remade American society in ways that we're still dealing with today for good and for bad. And to me, the answer, and I hope this isn't too cynical, and I wonder how you guys feel about this, is they made their politics boring, and then suddenly they managed to make rapid change. That when politics is thrilling in the 19th century, when you want to turn out and march and drink and shout, they make no significant reforms for decades and decades. And then as they restrain politics, as they make it more kind of thoughtful and calm and interior, as they make the act of voting less interesting, as they make the parties less kind of central in American life, and as turnout crashes, and especially kind of working class Americans stop paying attention, then these kind of expert managers in the progressive era come in and make all these reforms. And it's easier for them to do so because they don't have 80% of the electorate staring down their back, So I don't know, we kind of have this vision of how change should happen. And it seems like it's out of a Hollywood movie where the people gather up and they all pay attention and they make some big grand change. But I think we have precedent in this country for change sometimes happens when people are paying attention less. It kind of opens the door sometimes. So I'm not endorsing people not voting or people not paying attention. I don't know how to square all that, but it does seem like we have this history that
it does kind of sound like you're suggesting that though, because if we could just get everybody to quit voting and for people to not know what's going on, then we could actually get some stuff done.
The crux of what you're saying is if politicians didn't worry about getting reelected, then they could do the business of the country and make us a better. Yeah. And we seem right now, everything is all about getting reelected. I mean, it feels that way. I'm stereotyping, but it feels like, well, everything I do is going to be looked at under a microscope and I need people to vote for me. So I don't want to do anything because then half the people aren't going to like what I do, instead of, you know what, this is what needs to be done to move the country forward.
It is an interesting point, and it kind of brings up the next set of questions, which are possibly impossible to answer. But on page 237, you quote Lincoln or Lenny Steffens asking, "Do we Americans really want good government? Do we know it when we see it? Are we capable of that sustained good citizenship which alone can make a democracy a success? Are we capable of that sustained good citizenship which alone can make a democracy a success?"
Yeah, I'm so glad you quoted that. Lincoln Steffens is this incredible muckraking journalist who wrote this book, Shame of the Cities, which is basically about political corruption. And he lays it out, as you say. He says right near that quote, he says, "The misgovernment of the American people is the misgovernment by the American people," which he's really saying, he's pointing at the voters and saying, what are you going to do about it, basically? I can't say what we can do today, but I can say that we have a history and a precedent of making significant change and reform to improve our political system. That the people who hung out with Lincoln Steffens and looked at the political system in 1900 and said, this is an awful mess, made deliberate, thoughtful, self-conscious change. They made a political system that was partisan and public and passionate, independent and private and restraint. And they built deliberately a new political culture over a generation. And they did so against huge odds. Not all their changes were good. They did some harmful things also, but we have this history that reform works. It is possible. I think we kind of talk about, politics as if we're going in some kind of inevitable decline or heading towards some kind of inevitable cliff. But we have a huge precedent in our history of people making significant change. And one of the things that's really interesting and maybe relevant for today is that a lot of the positive changes, the groundwork was laid well before you saw their impact. That reformers did things in 1887 or 1890 that by 1900 or 1910 had major significant change. There are these positive signs on the horizon, and it can get worse before it gets better. That's the history from the Gilded Age, that a lot of those big reformers thought they'd lost, and then 10 years later found that they'd made huge impact and made huge success.
For our last question, your book covers many important lessons, and we've only had a time to cover a few of them today. From the creation of the private ballot and constitutional amendments to high voter turnout and national anger, the age of acrimony saw many changes. but perhaps what our listeners most want to know is what changes do you see for us on the horizon? So we know you're optimistic. What do you think? What are we headed for? Or are we already in a second age of acrimony? Will somebody 100, 150 years from now write a sequel to your book? Or if we get, this, as Justin likes to think about in science, this ability to live forever, will you write a sequel and say, what will you say about this time period in the early 21st century and what changes came about? If you had your crystal ball and could look into it.
It's such a great question because, these objects we collect for the Smithsonian, that we hope they'll be behind glass in 200 years. And so part of what we do is we study the past to explain it to the present. And then we collect the present to try to help our moment make sense to people in the future. So yeah, I think about that all the time, and historians really shouldn't predict the future.
We're not very good at it, are we?
It's so far. Yeah, right. I have a pretty bad track record myself. I guess the one thing I'll say, trying to say something about the future by looking backwards through American history, is I think we have these two narratives of our past. The one is that things are always progressing and getting better, and the founders gave us this great system and we just improve it all the time. And then there's this other one, which is pretty focused on the Civil War. And we say today we're more divided than we've ever been since the Civil War. And that kind of implies ... another civil war, another cataclysm, something like that is inevitable. But we've been incredibly divided at other points in our history, including in the Gilded Age. We've had mass political violence. We've had incredible frustration and belief that democracy was dying. And instead of it leading to another civil war, it led ultimately to reforms that made things more peaceful and more calm. So I think just the more we dig into this big past we have and we share, the more options we find for our future, where the more kind of resilience we see and flexibility, and also the more trade-offs. Some of the good reforms bring really negative things with them, but I just think the palette of our past is bigger and more diverse than we often give it credit. And so I hope by studying this history, at the very least, we can kind of broaden our thinking and not feel so tied up in the moment and like things are coming to some cataclysm, because there's precedent for so many different changes in our past.
Jon, not to shift away from your book, because I think, as we've talked about, we could spend most of the day discussing the various points. There's a lot of lessons and a lot of information packed into a few number of pages. But it is important to note, obviously, that you're the Curator of Political History at the Smithsonian's for National Museum of American History. What's happening at the museum right now? What is this? Why should people come? What's exciting that you're looking forward to, either right now or over the next several months? I've been very fortunate in my life to make it to your museum a number of times. Believe it or not, our senior resident historian has not been to your museum, which is like the greatest crime of our time.
Well, yeah, definitely. Please come and we'll give you a tour, and we'll rectify that. Not visiting the Smithsonian, we can change that quickly. But the most exciting thing is that we're reopening to the public. That the Smithsonian exists for the public, and it exists to kind of preserve our material history. There's something different about standing in front of objects than reading about them in a book, as valid as that also is. And so since the pandemic, it's been off and on closed to the public, and we are open currently. So just the fact that American citizens can stand in front of their objects and their collections again is a wonderful thing. We have great exhibitions up on democracy, on immigration. There's a cool new exhibition on girlhood and the history of kind of youth in American history. And there's research, and we're collecting ongoing. I'm trying to collect objects from both 19th century American politics, the Lincoln campaign, and from contemporary moments. And I've, many, many, many great colleagues who are studying the history of entertainment and food and money and all these really valid things, and beer and all these important things in American history. Like I said before, it's big and diverse, and please engage with us in person or online and see what we're doing.
How can we use what we've learned today from Jon Grinspan in our modern society, and how might these observations better inform our conversations about today's leaders? That's what Lance and I are going to discuss in the next segment of the show. Jon, we appreciate you taking time to speak with Lance and me.
Yeah, thank you. It was an honor. I really appreciate it.
You can purchase Jon's new book, The Age of Acrimony, by going to thestateofus.org or find it anywhere books are found. What do Lance and I think about the case Jon has made, and what does the future hold for our nation? Well, to find out, keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back.
We are The State of Us. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
The Age of Acrimony, How Americans Fought to Save Their Democracy from 1865 to 1915. That's the book that Lance and I have had the opportunity to read. It's by Jon Grinspan, who is the Curator of Political History at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. You know, compared to some of the history books we've read that are, 500 or 600 pages, he manages to fit, I think, a lot into this.
If you like human interest story, he ties the history into the father-daughter relationship of
Right.
Senator Will Kelly from Pennsylvania and Florence Kelly, who I knew more about than her dad, the progressive leader. And he makes the point, that 100 years from the time that Will Kelly stepped on stage to give his first political speech to the death of his daughter and what took place from 1832 to 1932. So yes, it's 1865 to 1915, but for those of you who like the human interest side of American history, there's this underlying or ongoing theme of this relationship between this father and daughter and how they worked to make a lot of these changes.
Yeah, well, and I think that's the point, Lance, obviously, is that there's a lot of different things you can take away from the book. Obviously, today we focused pretty heavily on the themes of the time period and not so much the people, but there are some interesting lessons to be learned about individuals that played an important part in American history that are not the ones that you find on our money or that you hear about frequently in history class. Or if you do, it's more of a passing kind of mention than it is, talking about somebody like George Washington or Thomas Jefferson or Abraham Lincoln, individuals, right, or FDR, that we're gonna spend time on these folks, and we don't really do that for some of these others. But I think as you read, you learn they were very important parts of our democracy. And kind of the central question, I guess, that we want to try to answer and address is this idea, Lance, right, that's brought up on page 263 of the book. And there's a couple different things mentioned here, but the one that we're going to reference is where John writes, in 1943, in the midst of a war for democracy, referring to World War II, the Writers' War Board asked the New Yorker to compose a statement on, quote, the meaning of democracy. The magazine put its best writer to the task. E.B. White responded with a beautiful humanistic definition, including these lines. Democracy is the recurrent suspicion that more than half of the people are right more than half of the time. It is the feeling of privacy in the voting booths, the feeling of communion in the libraries, the feeling of vitality everywhere. Democracy is a letter to the editor. Democracy is a request from a war board in the middle of a morning, in the middle of a war, wanting to know what democracy is. Fair, but also points out the paradoxical nature of democracy, right? And the challenge that's highlighted of, while we may feel, Lance, right, that there are times where we were less divided, it's not necessarily that we were less divided. It's just that we were doing a better job of getting along or had bigger problems to tackle than bickering. Because the Age of Acrimony seems to highlight that, oh my gosh, look how divided everybody is. And you had told me, well, yes, but that's because everybody was paying attention to politics, right? Not necessarily because they suddenly became different minded. It's everybody was engaged in it because that was the entertainment. That was the thing to do. And then, the 1920s roll around and we have, all this new stuff happening, and then the Great Depression, and then World War.
I think the book and John do a great job of showing that our past isn't what we think it was, because we tend to think, well, the past was just like today. I mean, it was different because, well, they they dressed differently. They didn't have the modes of transportation or communication. But basically, the American system of government has been the same since its inception. And what the book does a great job of showing us is that it is an evolution, that what our founding fathers, they got it started, they got the ball rolling. And as John points out in the book, that there's this age of Jackson, and when Will Kelly starts, and then things became very partisan. And then, as you pointed out in our discussion with him, that Will Kelly said, you know what, this isn't getting done what I want to get done. And so we see this change. And then we see his daughter, who worshiped what Will Kelly had done, kind of say, you know what, Dad, this isn't working and we need to go off on a different direction, and then come back. And, so it's like, it's this ebb and flow. And everybody thinks, unfortunately, I should say everybody, so many people think, they listen to the major media outlets who try to portray it, well, this is America and this was America from the beginning and this is what we need to get back to doing. That's never been America. America has been a country of ebb and flow, of stops and direction changes and going back and circling, and it's okay. I think that's the big point, is it's all right. That democracy isn't this straight line from Adams and Jefferson to Trump and Biden. That it is a curvy road that we have taken, an interesting path, and it's okay that we're in a stage where it seems a little bit chaotic, and that good things will come from this. Maybe not as quickly as we want in this instant gratification society that we live in now, but I think it's going to be okay. And maybe that's just my optimistic attitude, but I really do believe that things will get better, and sometimes things have to get worse before we figure out what's really important to us.
Very early in the book, actually, in the preface, John writes, much of what Americans value about their democracy was not passed down by the founders, but invented by restrainers a century later. Our views on voting rights, public service, corruption, independent journalism, partisan outrage, and political violence. Few 21st century Americans would want to participate in elections as they looked in 1868 or 1884. Indeed, mostly simply could not. And that brings me to one other point that I wanted to mention, because we managed to talk the whole show, and I think one of the most important things that we just kind of I don't know, it really clicked, I guess, when I was reading this book, that we had the Civil War, right? And we're fighting this huge fight over, slavery and who has rights and who's a person and who's a citizen. And then that just feels like it all went dark until the civil rights movement. And the truth of it is, no, it didn't. It was a very odd time, because you had some black men in some states who could vote. And then you had other places, many places, where they could not. And it was this very weird mishmash kind of trying to figure it all out. And I think we forget that we were very close. It didn't happen, but we were very close to enacting similar scale reforms for civil rights almost 100 years before we actually got it done. And I think that goes to prove what you were just talking about, Lance, which is this idea, right, that there is an ebb and flow, and there are moments in our history where we're ready, and then right, wrong, or indifferent, because I think we would all agree we wish it probably would have happened sooner than it did. It shouldn't have taken another 100 years, but it didn't happen, even though arguably they were very, very close to making many of those changes.
Well, I think it's interesting too, just very quickly, that we tend to group people when we talk about them in history. And the black politicians and the black political leaders of the time differed on what direction politics should take. Who should we support? How should we do this? And I think that's what's very interesting is that it's not like there was one thought and everybody just jumped on the bandwagon and pushed that direction. There was difference of thought and difference of opinion as what was the best course of action to get this equality. And I think, and that's, if you study the civil rights movement of the 1850s and 60s, that was true. You know, you had Martin Luther King and his nonviolent, and then you had the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, you know, SNCC. And it's like, oh my gosh, the people who led the movement didn't agree on what the best course of action was. Well, yeah, that's called because they're humans and we don't all agree. And I think that's just a real good point that's just kind of underlying in the book, is that not everybody agreed. We tend to group people because it's easier for us to understand things if we say, well, everybody was alike, and they weren't. You know, all these politicians had different ways to solve the problem, and that's okay. And we'll get to a solution eventually. Do we wish it would happen quicker and more smoothly? Of course. But that's not how democracy works.
I think one of the biggest lessons to take away, and we'd like to know what you think, send us an email, podcast@thestateofus.org, podcast@thestateofus.org. We want to hear from you. My big takeaway, right, is this idea that you and I have shared some on the concept that we can be mad at the system and we can be mad at the people in charge, but at the end of the day, we need to look in the mirror, because do we have a perfectly equal system of representation? No, we don't, you know, but it's never been perfect. Doesn't mean we shouldn't try to make it better, but it does mean we do have the ability to make changes. We have to decide that we want to make them. And if we don't like the people in charge, it's a reflection of us more than it is a reflection of the system. Now, granted, there are some big problems like gerrymandering, which we've talked about at length, that are newer and introduce additional systemic challenges, right? So I don't want to be blind to things like that either, to say that there's nothing wrong with the system, because I think Lance and I have both said many times there's lots we could do to improve it. But that's why we have these conversations, Lance, right? Is we're just trying to start that dialogue with folks.
That is correct. Our mission here at True Chat is to educate people by providing honest, open, and respectful conversations. And we've had that today through the discussion of a great book, The Age of Acrimony, How Americans Fought to Fix Their Democracy. Please check it out. Please read it. It's a very good read. It's very interesting. Share it with your friends and your family and your coworkers. And if you enjoy it, tell them, hey, where do you find this stuff? You can tell them, well, you can find the show on Spotify, Overcast, Stitcher, Apple Podcast, and everywhere podcasts are found.
The State of Us is released Tuesdays and Thursdays by 4 a.m. Eastern Time as a podcast, and we're also heard on the weekends in select talk radio markets around the country. For The State of Us on True Chat in Urbana, Ohio, I'm Justin T. Weller.
I'm Lance Jackson.
Special thanks to our guest, Jon Grinspan, for participating in today's show and for sharing with us his book. As always, a thank you to our producer, Bradley Butch, and our audience. We greatly appreciate you tuning in. We'll see you next time. Be the change. Be sure to check out our website, thestateofus.org, for books, articles, and all the ways to tune in. thestateofus.org.